the 6 days, and we really have to end up asking ourselves, well, at this point, then we can see that there is really ultimately no orthodox Christian view of an old earth. That's what I'm going to delve into now, right? Some of the looking at some of the church fathers, some of the reformers and the like, right? And really coming to this understanding that there is no such thing as an orthodox Christian view of an old earth. It's actually a very new idea in Christianity. And that's the key phrase here, right? In Christianity, because the reality is the idea of an ancient earth is a very, very old idea. And yet you will find every time throughout history, particularly ancient history, the idea of an old earth comes up, millions of years, deep time, and yes, even evolution. The reality is it is always associated with paganism. I mean, you go back to the ancient Babylonians, right? And you find that they believed in a universe that was nearly 3 million years old. By the time you get to the Hindus, the ancient Hindus, right, you find that they believed in a universe that was almost 3 trillion years old. And you can actually trace this all the way down through history from the ancient Sumerians through the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hindus. And by the time you get to the ancient Greeks, they've now applied their pagan mindset, their pagan philosophy to the idea of naturalistic thinking, or rather they've taken the pagan ideology and put it through a naturalistic thinking process, and they've come up with the idea that not only is the universe millions of years old and the earth deep, deep time, right, millions of years old, but that given enough time, life can arise from non-life, and that certain creatures known as hopeful creatures will arise from creatures that can actually go on and reproduce and do better than other creatures. And basically we're dealing with an idea of natural selection and evolution. And so you'll find every time this idea of deep time and millions of years and evolution crops up in history, it is always associated with paganism and nothing to do with Christianity. So let's delve down a little bit deeper into this idea of an old earth, into this idea about a young earth creation, and see what comes up. Well, we're going to start with a reference to Shakespeare. In fact, let me just pull up my... So you can see on the screen, we've got a quote from William Shakespeare out of one of his plays. And you can see here the quote says, "The poor world is almost 6,000 years old." Now, William Shakespeare is not necessarily the most child-friendly or Christian-friendly thing to go reading sometimes, but what it does give you is a nice little insight into the culture and beliefs of the time. You can actually see this through literature down throughout history, and in fact, I would encourage you to go back and watch some of the original Creation Research Unplugged series that we did. We put them back on YouTube back in 2020 in the middle of lockdown, right? But we went through a whole load of old pieces of literature, right? Classic literature as well, and actually dug out references to the Bible and Christianity in it. And John did a great job of looking through some of the old King James, as well as some of things like William Shakespeare and the like, which references things that people believed at the time, particularly about the world, and particularly about the world in light of the Bible. You see, you find that when William Shakespeare was writing that in 1599, most people believed that the world was about 6,000 years old. Now, by the time you get down to Gilbert and Sullivan, right, who wrote the sort of the comedy dramas of the time, right, the sort of the not quite opera kind of plays type stuff, you find that all of a sudden there are references to, well, my lineage is clearly the best because I'm the elite, because I go to a pre-Adamic line. Pre-Adamic? Oh, yeah, the idea now that there were people living before Adam, and therefore those who are descended from them are part of the elite. It's interesting, and Gilbert and Sullivan were writing in, 17, 1800s, and so you've got a change in beliefs from the time of William Shakespeare, believing that the earth was around 6,000 years old, to the time of Gilbert and Sullivan, where they were believing that the universe was much, much older. Okay, yeah, there's no real orthodox view of deep time of millions of years, really, before Charles Lyell and his introduction of this idea of deep time into the church. Okay, well, let's look at what the church believed. Let's go back into the history book. Theophilus of Antioch. Creation occurred, he said, 5529 BC, give or minus 200 years. When did he live? Well, 15, sorry, well, 115 to 180 AD. Fairly new in the world of the church, but look at what he commented. Not the tens of thousands of Plato, etc., have written. Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, says the Bible, and the reality is the idea of deep time and millions of years is not a new idea. It's an old idea, and it's a pagan idea. And there's nothing new under the sun because the early church recognized this. They recognized that the world was young compared to what the pagan Greeks were claiming. I mean, today we're claiming that the world is young compared to what the pagan academics. Interesting, really. Plato and many others of the philosophers, they perhaps follow the Chaldeans. You see, when was the last time that you heard that the ancient Babylonians believed in millions of years? Most people don't realize this. The church fathers did. Look, they followed the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who foolishly say that the world is 470,000 years. But we, whom the Holy Scriptures instruct to the knowledge of the truth, of course, being Jesus Christ, know that the beginning and the end of the world, therefore let the philosophers who enumerate thousands of ages from the beginning of the world know that the 6,000th year is not yet completed. You see, even in the early church, you have a recognition that the universe is young compared to what the pagan philosophers believe. Pagan philosophers, natural theologians, natural philosophers, those were the scientists of the day. Augustine, which many theistic evolutionists love to claim is their best friend, because you see, Augustine was interesting because he wrote an awful lot about the theology of creation. And it's absolutely true. There is an enormous amount of theology to be found hidden in the first few chapters of Genesis. Information about God, information about what God is like, information about what God does, information and understanding about who God is. But just because he saw rich theological content in the early chapters of Genesis doesn't mean that he believed that they could just be taken purely as a theological writing as opposed to history. Look at what Augustine had to say. Let us then admit the conjectures of men who know not what they say when they speak of the origin and the nature of the human race. They are deceived too by those highly mendacious documents which profess to give a history of many thousand years, though by reckoning or by the sacred writings we find that not 6,000 years have yet passed. Now, there's no doubt about it, the early church and the church fathers, even up to Augustine, believed that the world was young compared to the pagan philosophers. Not yet 6,000 years have passed. Okay, by the time you get to the reformers, the church had really fallen into darkness. They'd fallen away from what the early church fathers had believed. In fact, they'd actually fallen away from a belief in 6 days of creation, not into millions of years necessarily, but actually into the opposite. They were teaching, the Catholic Church at the time, the Roman Catholic Church at the time, was teaching that God had created in just one day. Um, hmm. Okay, well, what did some of the reformers have to say? John Calvin on the age of the earth. Albeit the duration of the world, now declining to its ultimate end, has not yet attained 6,000 years. God's work was completed not in a moment, but in 6 days. In fact, even Martin Luther waged in on this on his commentary on Genesis. He said, "We know that from Moses that about 6,000 years ago the world was not yet in existence. Although of this fact no philosopher can be convinced." Nothing new under the sun for sure, because even Luther is pointing out the fact that according to the Bible, the earth is young compared to the dates and the ages given by the philosophers of the time. The philosophers that matched the philosophers, by the way, of the ancient Greeks. And John Calvin claimed that not 6,000 years has yet passed. And then entering Archbishop James Ussher, who was way, way up in the world of theology, was actually involved in both the Catholic and the Anglican Church. He was that well regarded. He was an expert in Semitic languages. He was a historian and a scholar, and he went back to the Bible. He used biblical genealogies to conclude when creation took place. Surprisingly, not actually to try and really have anything to do with creation, but to work out when Easter was. But he did it by basing it back in Genesis. And you see, he came to the conclusion that the world, according to the Bible, was created in 4004 BC. What does that make it? Around 6,000 years old. You see, between 1483 and 1546, Luther, with the Reformation in 1517, believed in 6 literal days around 6,000 years ago. Calvin believed in 6 literal days around 6,000 years ago. Archbishop Usher believed in 6,000 years, 6 literal days around 6,000 years ago. Then introducing a man named Buffon. Buffon was one of the French revolutionaries. And you see, the French revolutionaries had a little bit of a problem. They wanted to chop the king's head off. Of course, if you try and chop the king's head off, what you're doing is you're causing treason. And you're actually causing double treason because you see, if you live in high Catholic France, you believe that God appoints the monarch. I mean, that's actually a biblical principle, right? God gives us rulers, and he gives us good rulers, and he gives us bad rulers. But you see, if you want to chop the king's head off, not only are you challenging the king, you're actually challenging God. And so you begin to see a movement away from a Catholic/Christian belief system into a more naturalistic, pagan inspired belief system, because at the end of the day, if life can arise from non-life and over millions of years can give rise to kings, then actually it means that that king has no real God-given authority. And so you can chop the king's head off. Happy days, right? And you see, Buffon was one of the first people to really introduce the idea that the world was very old. You see, he argued that Adam and Eve came into being just, what's that, 6 to 8,000 years ago? But the earth itself has been in existence for 75,000 years. In fact, one of the commentators on this made this point. No one before had mentioned figures of this magnitude. Before felt that Noah's flood had made little impact in the world. Earth's geological features had come from normal everyday effects of wind and water. His book, The Epochs of Nature, uses what would become known as the principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that the world is uniform. The present is the key to the past. I mean, one thing you'll find with history, right, is that France and England haven't really gotten on very well. Neither have England and Scotland. And so you'll find that France and Scotland are actually pretty close pals. And you'll find that by this point, James Hutton, who's a Scotsman, is also developing this idea of uniformitarianism. And you'll find that this idea of deep time was introduced into the church in the United Kingdom actually through the Scots, influenced by the French and pushed by people like James Hutton and John Playfair, and really, really pushed forward by a certain man named Charles Lyell. But you see, before that, in 1814, in order to try and challenge this, in order to try and fit the idea of millions of years into the Bible, Thomas Chalmers is simply arguing that there's a huge gap in the Bible and the earth is now hundreds of thousands of years old. And all of a sudden you find this sneaky little element of millions of years and deep time starting to move into the Bible. But this is not ancient. This is not historical. This is not orthodox. This is only in the last couple of hundred years. In 1816, Scotsman Charles Lyell graduates in law in Oxford. His book, The Principles of Geology, published in 1830, presents geological evidence from England, France, Italy, and Spain in order to prove James Hutton correct and to actually start a push to get rid of the idea of catastrophism, such as Noah's flood, and to prove uniformitarianism, the idea that the world is uniform. There's Charles Lyell's catchphrase. The present is the key to the past. In the Natural History Museum in London. Yeah, whatever's been happening today has always been happening. In fact, that's the explanation for all things. So if you see a little stream slowly eroding away a tiny little gully today, it must have taken millions of years to carve out a Grand Canyon. Therefore, the Bible cannot be trusted. Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. That was ultimately Lyell's aim. His aim, quote unquote, to free the science from Moses. Not Christianity, you see, because this is still, high Victorian England. It's still Christian England. Hypocritical Christian England, but Christian England nonetheless. And if Charles Lyell had turned around to say, I want to free science from Christianity, most people would have gone, no way. But he didn't do that. He set out to free the science from Moses. Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And you see, the reality is, if you destroy those five things which are found if you destroy those five books of the Bible, you're destroying the five foundational pieces to Christianity. Because in those five books of the Bible, you find the origin of the universe and the world, you find the origin of sin, you find the judgment of mankind at Noah's flood, you find the history of mankind at the Tower of Babel, and you find the law of God. Get rid of those five things, and the rest of Christianity simply comes falling down. And Charles Lyell knew this. You see, the reality is there is no such thing as an orthodox orthodox old earth view. There is no idea of an orthodox millions of years view in Christianity. The church fathers and the reformers knew very well that the Bible taught that the world was only a few thousand years old. Not millions, not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, as the pagans have said. And you see, this idea of millions of years being fitted into the Bible, whether you want to go for ruin reconstruction, whether you want to go for gap theory, whether you want to go for theistic evolution, however you want to try and fit it in, you have to recognize that it never actually became a thing until Charles Lyell set out to actually destroy the Bible. In other words, by trying to fit in the millions of years, you're actually helping him achieve his aim. Be careful about what you're allowing to fit into your worldview and to fit into your ideology. Yeah, there is no such thing as an orthodox old earth view in Christianity, unless you want to argue that all history was happened in the last 200 years. Okay, maybe I'll be a bit cheeky then and say that in my experience, that's what most Americans believe. But I have to say it's starting to come even here in the UK, where you're taught nothing much more beyond a couple of hundred years ago in terms of history, industrial revolution, and off you go. No, it pays to actually learn a lot of history and also to understand where people like Lyell were coming from. They knew that they had a huge amount of history that they had to rewrite, history that was based on the Bible. That's why they went back to the pagan roots, and why Lyell even admitted his whole idea of trying to get rid of Genesis was based on a rewriting of history, on a historical sketch, he called it. So don't be surprised that Charles Darwin, who introduced us, or reintroduced us rather, popularized the idea of evolution, because it wasn't a new idea. He actually said half of his ideas came out of Lyell's brain, and he was never given enough credit. Yeah, be wary about what you're letting into your views about the Bible. Stick with the Bible and stick with it the way that God said he did it, because even in the law of God, in the Ten Commandments, it's stated, for in 6 days the Lord God made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them.